His research has also examined students' learning-related behaviors and their causes, consequences, and relationship to the achievement gap. Professor Farkas has authored or co-authored 4 books, and his articles have appeared in a number of journals. When I was counting them on your CV, it was like over 25. I was like, that's a lot of academic journals to be publishing in. Professor Farkas has applied his knowledge and interest in the achievement gap to develop a successful tutoring program that improved reading skills of low-income, minority, and limited English proficient elementary school students. This tutoring program, Reading 1-to-1, was widely implemented throughout the country and helped invent President Clinton's America Reads initiative. Professor Farkas was elected to the Sociological Research Association in 1996, and today he will be talking about K-8 programs to reduce achievement gaps, what works best. Welcome, Professor Farkas, to UCCS, and thank you so much for speaking today.
Okay. Thank you. Is the sound good? Okay. I'm going to do a quick and dirty summary of the entire research literature on K-8 education. So let me apologize ahead of time that obviously you can't hit all the nuances if you're going to cover so much ground. And what I'm interested in is I'm interested in serious changes that will help kids in poverty and narrow the achievement gaps and increase their chances for complete and successful lives. And to do that, you have to consider a lot of things that others have considered, and you have to sometimes say things that others are offended by or don't want to hear. So I'm just apologizing ahead of time that I understand that I'm leaving out nuance to try to get the main points across as I see them. So the problem is that children from the lowest SES socioeconomic status quintile begin kindergarten more than 1 standard deviation lower than children in the top SES quintile in both reading and math. This is widely known. It's been true for some time. 1 standard deviation is a lot, and these gaps are large, and they exist at the beginning of school. So, you know, if you want to blame the schools, the gaps are there before the kids enter school. They are about 0.6 of a standard deviation in academic work habits. So we have learned how to test little kids on their knowledge of numbers, their knowledge of letters, their vocabulary. You can show stick figures and say, what's that? And they should be able to say boat and rabbit. And these things, these skills that preschoolers are learning are enormously predictive of how successful they will be at reading in first grade. And how well you do at reading in first grade is enormously predictive of how much education you will ever get. So this are findings that I began to realize around 1990, and ever since it's caused me to focus more on the early years. They are also about 0.25 of a standard deviation higher than children in the top SES quintile in antisocial behavior. These are simply questions asked of preschool or kindergarten teachers. Is this kid disruptive? Does this kid talk out of turn? And so on. These are data typically collected by the National Center for Education Statistics. The country's best psychometricians spend a lot of time inventing these questionnaires and making sure they have good psychometric properties. They are unbiased and so on. So once again, I obviously don't have time to go into that, but just about everybody who's a professional in this field, I think, believes that this is accurate, objective information. These gaps are either unchanged or increased as students move through their schooling careers. So these days, it's not very hard to make a graph where you put together standardized reading scores that kids achieved in grades K1, 3, 5, 8. And if you plot those, you will see that everybody grows and everybody learns more, and the lower SES kids and the higher SES kids start one standard deviation apart, and they end one standard deviation apart. They grow in parallel. That's a kind of stylized finding if you've read a lot of papers, or I've estimated that myself. But one standard deviation, by the time you're in 8th grade or 12th grade, can be as much as 3 years of learning. So this one standard deviation in kindergarten ends up being one standard deviation in high school, which is 3 grades behind, perhaps, on average. So how can we close the gap? Lots of things have been suggested. Lots of things have been tried. And like I said, I'm going to give you a very aggressive tour of my personal summary of what I've learned from reading this literature. Preschool and kindergarten interventions. Personally, I believe that we need to do those. We need to eliminate that gap at the beginning, and then we need to keep it closed, and that will be a matter of continuous effort. Instructional innovations and interventions. I'm in a school of education, and lots of my colleagues, that's what they do. They do instructional innovations and interventions. New way of teaching math, using computers to help bilingual students learn to read English better. I've participated in these evaluations of these interventions. There are more than hundreds of them continuously being tried around the country. Once again, social and emotional learning programs, programs that teach kids kind of mediation instead of fighting as ways to settle disputes. There are famous programs funded by NIH for 5 or 10 years around the country. Summer instructional programs. At one point or another, summer fallback became a very famous topic. And it has been argued that a lot of the gap just occurs during the summer. And it has been shown that students grow during the school year and don't grow on average during the summer, particularly low-income students. And that certainly conforms with common sense, and it's a good thing to learn they are growing when they're getting instructed, so maybe we just have to fix it during the summer. Accountability and choice. So everybody knows about charter schools, and everybody knows about No Child Left Behind, and all of the efforts and all of the arguments that have been brought to bear on these issues. Supplemental Educational Services, particularly after-school tutoring. As you'll hear, I'm very positive toward tutoring, particularly if it's one-to-one tutoring. No Child Left Behind included provisions for lots of what's called SES, Supplemental Education Services, and it included a lot of money for those. And as happens in the education field, a lot of entrepreneurs and companies jumped in to provide this, and a crazy quilt of combinations of the school district doing itself and hiring different sorts of vendors to provide after-school tutoring have been what we've seen over the last so many years. That's another possibility. Intensive tutoring during the school day has been tried less, but as you'll see, it's one of my favorites, and it's a lot easier to do tutoring during the school day than after school, because after school, the kids have already put in a full day, they're tired, they want to play, and at 3 o'clock or whenever school ends, things are usually a bit chaotic, and it's kind of hard to round up the kids that you're supposed to get. And so there's a lot of impediments to doing a really good job after school, but nevertheless, after school is a famous effort being made. Finally, whole school reform, including charter schools, comprehensive programs, and complete reorganizations. Betsy DeVos is a name that is usually booed in schools of education these days, and I would boo her also. But the issue of charter schools is pretty complicated, and I want to talk about that a bit also. So my goal is to give an opinionated review of the research findings and hopefully to spark discussion and debate. So I want to emphasize that I know I'm painting with a broad brush, and you know, if I gore your favorite program, perhaps you'll tell me why I'm wrong. So when you look at preschool and kindergarten programs, unfortunately, the impacts of Head Start are disappointingly small these days. Congress mandated a random assignment study of Head Start, and the results were very disappointing. The effect size is 0.1 of a standard deviation. So on average, a kid, if you have a treatment and a control group, and they're randomly assigned because we don't have enough money to serve all kids who might want and need Head Start. So they were able to do this study by talking some Head Starts into picking the ones they would serve randomly. So you've got those who were picked and those who weren't picked, and at the end of the year, you give them a reading test, and you'll find that the treated kids score 0.1 of a standard deviation higher. Now remember, the achievement gap is 1.0 standard deviation, so 0.1 is a bit disappointing. And one of the topics that has recently interested people in this field a lot is the fact that all these program effects fade out. So that 0.1 is gone by second grade. In other words, the treatment and the control group are no different. So if you want to be tough about it, why did we spend the money on the treatment group if we could have had the control group who's doing just as well? So everything is politicized, and everything can be seen from more than one angle. And of course, there continue to be a great many supporters of Head Start, but experts in the field know that the effects have been disappointing. There is a lot of debate in this field as to why that is and what we can do about it. And I'd say the current thinking is it's possibly because Head Start has no curriculum. That is to say, it's a national program. You would think that someone might have assembled the best child development people and have them create the best program and then tell all programs in the country, this is what you're going to do. But that is not the case. Each program does what it wants to do. Some of my colleagues have been studying this very intensively, and there are a modest number of programs that they tend to choose among, but it is generally believed by people I know in this field that they are not using the most effective possible curriculum. State pre-K became the answer to all this, and there was a big flurry in the research community when a researcher went and studied state pre-K in Oklahoma and got very big positive effects. And state pre-K, in other words, state-funded pre-K, separated from Head Start, federally funded, is proliferating all around the country in states. And the early studies of that showed quite large effects. And it all seemed very plausible because when it was state pre-K, they tended to require more certified teachers, and they tended to run it in elementary schools, in the space of elementary that was given by elementary schools. And I've been to schools where the principal will say, yes, we have state pre-K, and I want my children to be kindergarten ready, and so we have a big incentive to make sure this program is good. So it all makes great sense. And the only problem is that recent studies, more recent studies by very reputable people, very pro preschool people, have shown no effects. And so there was this study in Tennessee by Mark Lipsey and Dale Farran, who are at Vanderbilt and are two of the most respected people in the country. They've each worked on this subject for 40 or 50 years. And Dale, in particular, is someone who really believes in kind of honesty, and you're not helping the kids if you tout a program that's not really helping them. And so she has actually gone so far as to write a Brookings piece in which she says that some of the people studying Head Start have been unwilling to, or state pre-K, have been unwilling to advertise their null findings because they, don't want, quote, the Republicans to get that information and shut the programs down. But that, lying about it or hiding the results is not helping the kids. So Dale, who I know very well and is a very passionate person, and in fact was involved in the Abecedarian experiment, which is one of the experiments from 30, 40 years ago that's always touted as something that produced large effects. When Dale says, it's not working well, that's something I take very seriously. There were the Chicago Child Parent Study Centers. Arthur Reynolds did these pretty well-known studies. These were like community centers that brought kids and families in, and one of the ideas in this area has been, don't just treat the kid, treat the family, and all of these things tend to have a lot of plausibility with them, and the effects were quite good. It was never very widely disseminated, probably because the age range overlaps with Head Start and first grade and second grade. And though we're already paying for those things, and there just isn't the political will to add something and decide when would the kids do that, they're supposed to be doing these other things. So, I said I would review the literature, and this is a little monument in the literature, so I wanted to get it in. Most recently, once again, Boston Pre-K is a famous success story, and some people studied it recently, and it's said that it's using the best curriculum. The problem is that there has been fade out, and I was at the national meetings recently, and the people who continue to study this apparently are suddenly not getting such good effects, and they were kind of avoiding talking about it. And Dale Farran was there, and she kind of stood up and said, you can't do this. You reported the positive findings. When the findings aren't so good, you need to talk about that too, and we need to figure that out. It doesn't mean that we close the programs down. It means that we stick with it and make them better. Full-day kindergarten. Time on task really matters. Full-day kindergarten definitely produces bigger effects than half-day kindergarten. Effect sizes for literacy of 0.3 of a standard deviation. Larger effects for Hispanics, 0.7 of a standard deviation. Now we're talking. These are the kind of effect sizes we would like to see. And definitely, I'd say full-day kindergarten has got to be part of the answer. But quote, the problem is that we're already doing it. If you look at some of the national data that I've looked at, 70% of the kids in this national data are already getting full-day kindergarten. So there's not a lot of big gains left for giving it to everyone else. A double-dose kindergarten, that's been tried. In other words, you repeat kindergarten, redshirting it's sometimes called, and you make the kid older, and you teach them again their letters and their numbers, and they ought to be more ready for first grade. This gets very good effects. Letter ID, 0.5, phonemic awareness, 0.3. The way you learn to read in first grade is by knowing all your letters, 52 lower and uppercase, knowing the sound each of those makes, hearing the separate sounds, looking at the word, sounding it out fast enough that you can hear the word, and then connecting that to your oral vocabulary. So the skills that predict being a good reader in first grade are these skills: letter ID, phonemic awareness. This is a good idea. And certainly any kid that hasn't learned all the right stuff in kindergarten, I'd say it's probably a good idea to repeat kindergarten. There are people who don't want anyone to repeat anything and feel that it damages the kid socio-emotionally. I'm just not convinced that that's the case and that the trade-off is worth it. Because if you don't succeed in learning to read in first grade, the problem is that it's not the second grade teacher's job to teach you to read. And she's moving the class along. And it's just not going to happen that she's able to stop and get you up to where you have to get. So maybe it's a question of using effective curricula. And there's a curriculum called Building Blocks, which is touted as one of the very best. And we've worked with the guy who developed it, and we've analyzed his own data collected on it. Very big effect in kindergarten, and yet it fades out very dramatically. Imagine that you're getting a 0.7 effect size in math, pre-math, numbers, counting, shapes, but that by third grade, the comparison group has caught up. How disappointing. How did that happen? One belief is that the teachers who come after don't really know what to do with the kids who were caught up, that if the kids who were caught up are mixed in with kids who were not caught up, then she's just going to take the advantage that some of the kids are caught up and concentrate on the others. And so she will help the control group who didn't get the advancement to get back to where they belong, but the kids who got the advancement are kind of standing in place. So one of the things we've learned about these interventions is they tend to be a one-grade shot. You know, the investigators, the proposal they wrote said we're going to do this program for kindergarten or we're going to do this program for first grade. And it is very unusual for somebody to mount a program where it's K through 5 and we have enough resources to catch kids up and then keep them caught up. You just don't see that. Maybe, I believe we should, but you don't see a lot of that. Effective preschool and kindergarten programs for low-income children should be part of the overall strategy. You know, if you don't eliminate this gap at the beginning, then you're never going to eliminate it. Nobody has ever shown, as far as I know, an ability to take kids who are relatively far behind and simply eliminate that gap in the higher grades. And one reason for that is the comparison group is moving. So if you want to compare the 7th graders in a low-income school to the 7th graders in the well-to-do suburbs, the 7th graders in the well-to-do studies are still learning more every year. So you'd have to kind of teach at twice the rate with the kids who are the least advantaged. It's pretty hard to achieve that. So we need effective pre-K, universal pre-K. so that K to 3+ curricula can take advantage of the pre-K gains, or training kindergarten plus teachers to differentiate instruction depending upon where the kid is starting from. So that's the current thinking about kids who are given an early advantage and then it all fades out. We have to somehow get to the the real world of school is a complicated and chaotic place, and the teachers don't know that some of their kids had an intervention, and they don't know that what was done last year. They just got their class and they got to get going. So the idea of integrating this over multiple grades is something that really hasn't been achieved as far as I'm aware. The effects on early achievement need to be large and lead to a cascade of positive events that prevent fade out. In other words, you have to, in principle, if some kids get ahead, you may need to put them in special classes to keep them ahead. Of course, then you get into tracking, and people aren't happy with that. So it's always hard to figure out how to arrange these things. But this is becoming a major theme in the research. 1 or 2 year interventions produce effects that fade out. Really effective interventions are likely to be multi-year and have a mechanism to catch up students who fall behind in later years. Like I said, this seems obvious, but it's not something that you've seen in the literature very much up to this date. Some say we don't even know how to run effective preschool programs at scale. Now, one of the big issues in this literature is someone has a new program and you try it as an experiment, and the experiment is done in 50 schools or 10 schools, and the investigators are there all the time, and there's a kind of Hawthorne effect that everybody wants to do well and everybody's trying extra hard. The hard question turns out to be, can you take one of these things that appears to have pretty good effects and blow it up to a big school district, many school districts? It turns out that that is not easy to do, and often what looks promising has smaller effects once you try to do this. And once again, there's Dale Farran, who actually said in this Brookings piece, lack of evidence about which skills and dispositions are most important to affect in pre-K and what instructional practices would affect them. You know, that's like the basis of developmental psychology. And she's a famous professor of developmental psychology. And she's saying we haven't succeeded in the understanding the real nuts and bolts that we can do this. None of the widely used, she also went on to say, none of the widely used measures of classroom and center quality relate strongly, if at all, to child growth on the school readiness outcomes on which most pre-K programs are focused. There are measures that are used to rate these programs. Unfortunately, the research shows that they are pretty poorly predictive of outcomes for kids. They are obvious things like, does the teacher have a credential, and what's the class size, and all of this stuff. If you want to be tough and scientific about it, those measures in a data set are not very predictive of which groups of kids will do better later. So conclusions. Narrowing achievement gaps at school entry is important. We have curricula capable of doing so, but they're not widely used. The largest program, Head Start, doesn't use them and must be improved or replaced. Even if we achieve good-sized effects, we have to worry about later fade out. Not really a happy story. Instructional innovations and interventions in grades 1 to 8. We've had the reading and math wars. The reading wars were whole language versus phonics. Do you sound out or don't you? Teach the kid. The math wars continue. They are constructivist math versus drill and kill. Everybody on one side or the other feels very passionately about these. Some truces have been arranged, but the underlying different philosophies of education are still there. Where I come out is that specific instruction is particularly needed for kids from low-income households. So I favor phonics, and I favor lots of math practice. And I favor teaching the kids the math facts rather than having them discover them for themselves. So the peace treaty for reading, called Combination of Phonics and Whole Language. But if you get out in the classrooms, you'll discover that everybody who used to do whole language now says they also do phonics. But if you look at the materials they use books that are not decodable. So goodbye moon cannot be sounded out by a first grader. Bat, mat, sat, cat, those are the words that should be in books that a first grader first encounters. And then you work your way up to more complex words. So in other words, even when truce has been declared, the people who really believe in one side are just not going to completely adopt the other side. They're going to, in my view, cheat a little bit on the other side. But if the other side had an important point, then they won't be as effective. Also, unfortunately, phonics instruction, while effective with beginning readers, has failed to improve comprehension for older readers. So the phonics supporters, like myself, have been disappointed that the strong first grade reading we've produced through phonics programs tend to not transfer into strong reading comprehension in third and fourth grade. And that's where the research is today. And the belief is that it's about oral language. That if the kid comes from a household where they don't use a lot of more complex words and sentences, then when they encounter those in books, they're not going to be as good at it. The math war is still in progress. I fear that constructivist math is winning. There's little valid evidence that it's effective. Almost every math educator in a school of education believes in constructivist math. So what I am saying is heretical. I think it's because if you teach math the way you used to teach math, there's not much interesting you can do as a math professor of math education. And so it's appropriate for them to keep trying to invent new ways to teach math with new materials and new games. And I think that that's particularly ineffective for kids from low-income households. There are positive effects for individualized reading instruction. Double-dose algebra has shown some possibilities, but in other places it doesn't. In other words, when you're taking algebra, which turns out to be the big problem, low-income kids tend to not succeed at algebra, which is what keeps you from going to college or even graduating high school. And fraction seems to be the key to that, and dividing fractions seems to be the particular thing that's hard to teach. Some school districts have tried having 2 math classes for those kids. The evidence on that is mixed. Very famous people at the University of Michigan, Deborah Ball is president of the association. They summarize studies by saying that instructional innovations, oh my God, I'm sorry, I spent way too much time on this. 2 minutes. 4 minutes? Okay, 4 minutes. Conclusion, there's little evidence that innovations in K through 8 classroom instruction alone will solve the problem. The same thing for social and environmental learning programs. The effects are not large enough. The same for summer instructional programs. The effects are not large enough, and it's hard to run an effective program in the summer. Accountability programs have had mixed evidence. Test scores have gone up nationally, but there's reason to believe they were going up nationally. In general, as you know, people came to hate No Child Left Behind, and we are backing away from harsh accountability, although it's still there, and it's going to stay there, it appears, because the states believe in it. Supplemental educational services, by and large, when done by these vendors, have been ineffective and, in my mind, a waste of money. Intensive and extensive, structured, very small group tutoring during the school day. That's the thing, one of the things that I think can make a big difference. And I did create a paraprofessional tutoring program using college students, one-to-one reading instruction in the early grades in the 90s, and it helped invent Clinton's America Reads, which uses work-study students to do this in local school districts. And personally, I would like to see that greatly expanded. And personally, I'm doing it at UC Irvine these days. There are other people doing tutoring in Chicago. There are different ways to do tutoring. If I had the time, I would talk about it more. Whole school reform, by and large, has produced positive effects, but it's been rather expensive, and it hasn't closed the gaps completely. Charter schools in general have effects that are no different than public schools in general, but there are some charter schools that seem to have been very effective. The very small high schools that were started in New York have very good effects, and the no excuses schools, in particular the KIPP schools, seem to me to have had uniformly positive effects. And I think we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that really KIPP has done some amazing things. And the evaluations of it by some very tough people, econometricians at MIT, have uniformly produced big positive effects, including a kind of random assignment experiment that Mathematica did. So even though we don't want to kind of put charter schools everywhere, I would love to see the things that are done in KIPP brought into all public schools. Thank you.